much for this introduction, and also thank you for having me here. Today, I'm going to discuss a paper that is still a work in progress. We started it in 2022, right after the beginning of the war, the invasion of Ukraine from the Russian army. And it is co-authored with Stepan Mikula, also from Masaryk University, and Patrick Button from Tulane University. So in this study, we are going to investigate basically whether refugees from Ukraine are discriminated against, or said it another way, it's a way to measure whether the temporary protection regime that was established in order to help the integration of refugees from Ukraine worked as intended. Now I'll give you a short background that probably you don't even need to listen to, because everybody knows. So there is this war. Russia invaded Ukraine, and it caused a large refugees inflow toward the EU. Now, in order to ease the refugees settling within the EU, and also to balance the economic cost of the integration of Ukrainian refugees, the EU has activated this temporary protection regime that has been translated in each EU member country. And more specifically in Czech Republic, it was translated into a group of norms, a group of laws that together was nicknamed Lex Ukraine. The first iteration of this Lex Ukraine was valid from March 21st, 2022 to March 31st, 2023. This group of laws regulate various refugees welcoming aspects, and among other things, it prescribes immediate and free access to the Czech labor market. Usually, as we were discussing before the beginning of this presentation, refugees, when they enter a hosting country, they cannot start to work immediately. It will take some time to go through all the administrative process. Instead, in this case, when Ukrainians enter Czech Republic, they can start to work immediately. So in theory, they should be treated as if they were Czechs or they were permanent residents, okay? All else equal. There is currently no evidence as to whether this law or equivalent ones in the remainder of the EU has worked as intended. That is, whether it allowed the refugees quick integration into the labor market. So it's very important to study whether this law worked because of various reasons, and we found at least three that we think are important. First of all, because of social norms, social reasons. So Czech Republic is the third country in terms of absolute amount of refugees, and the first country in terms of per capita refugees. Within a few months after the beginning of the war, the population, the Czech population increased by 5%. So it's a very huge inflow of refugees. And also, Czech Republic is not historically an immigration country, right? Then it's very important to help the integration of refugees also for economic reasons, of course. When refugees enter the country, they are allowed to obtain about 200 euros. And then upon providing evidence that they are not able to financially, economically support themselves, they would be entitled to get 5 additional installments each month. Okay, so if things go like in the worst case scenario, so that refugees are not able to integrate economically, they are not able to provide for themselves within the first 6 months. If you multiply these 500 Czech crowns, that is about 200 something euros, times 6, times the amount of refugees that enter the country, you will get about an expenditure that is about 14.4 14.4 billion Czech crowns. And that is very huge if compared to other type of expenditures, such as the total cash benefits in various social policies from Czech Republic in 2019. Yeah, we chose 2019 because it was the latest statistics that was available. Plus, there are other expenditures to help refugees, social type of expenditures, such as different type of services that are provided and also housing. So it's very important to help them also to economically support themselves. And also the integration of refugees is very important for their future outcomes, because an early access to the labor market as early as possible would help them to have better future labor market prospects, and also, of course, related to that, it would lower the social expenditures in the future. So how did we measure whether the law worked as intended, or if there is discrimination against refugees? So we used a field experiment called correspondence test, right? Basically, correspondence test works in this way, at least in the matched pair version of the correspondence test. Imagine you are comparing two groups, like there is the control group and the treatment group. You send two messages, one per group, to the same employer, let's say 1 week apart. And the only difference between these two messages is the demographic characteristic of that group that could be signaled in the different ways. For instance, through a name, if you are studying, like in this case, Czech people and refugees, okay? And then you compare the response rate or the positive answer across the two groups, across all the different employers that you have contacted, and see whether there is a gap. If there is a gap, it's discrimination because you are controlling for all the characteristics. It's an experiment. So the correspondence test is very useful in this particular case because it doesn't suffer from the endogeneity that is typical of other methods that are used in the migration literature. And it's also a gold standard for the study of discrimination. So we adapted it in this particular study to verify whether the Lex Ukraine worked. Okay. In our experiment, we contacted firms with the fictive job inquiries. So we didn't answer to job advertisement, but we contacted firms and asked them whether they had a particular some job vacancy. What job? Unskilled jobs that are typical jobs that are taken up by refugees. So they are jobs that in which language differences, skills, experience are next to irrelevant. You don't need to send a CV or a cover letter. You don't need to interact with customers or manage co-workers. So think, for instance, of the case of cleaners or machine operators. Okay.
Look, just sorry, that's a bit of a strong statement that language is not. I mean, you still need instructions, right? To understand instructions of machine.
At least at the beginning, yes. At least at the beginning, language might make a difference. So what we did was that this experiment started right after the war, so we didn't have so much space for manipulating a lot of different aspects. But so first thing, we consider that the language proximity between Czech Republic and Ukrainian. Both languages are Slavic, and they are quite similar, and we measured it with this language proximity index. And I don't know if any of you can speak Italian or Spanish, but the proximity between Czech and the Ukrainian, like the Czech and Ukrainian are more similar than Italian and Spanish, to give an idea. So it doesn't take that much to start to understand at least the basics that would help you to get this type of job. Also, in our particular experiment, we don't compare only Czech people and refugees, but we also have permanent residents. So Ukrainian permanent residents. If we compare refugees and Ukrainian permanent residents, that would capture somehow the role of the language, right? Because a Ukrainian permanent resident should be able to speak Czech. The comparison is not super clean because permanent residents are not refugees. Okay, we are aware of that. We will be also adding a third wave of the experiment where we will test directly the language proficiency, because now there are a lot of courses that are offered by the government, by local institutes, private institutes, even the university, and so on and so forth. So it's possible for refugees to study Czech relatively easy. Like there are a lot of courses, so we will be able to see whether we will randomize also the language proficiency and knowledge of the refugees. So we will take it in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So with this manuscript, we contribute to various branches of the economic literature. We will test several hypotheses, and all of them, they are mentioned in this pre-registration at the AEA RCTA registry, and they are public. So the first thing that we want to study is whether the lexicon worked as intended. So there shouldn't be any gap between in the callback rate between Czech and the refugees. Okay. Then we study something else that I think is quite interesting in this novel also within economics. So we don't have just Czechs and refugees. First of all, we differentiate between the refugees based on their language group, whether they speak Ukrainian or they speak Russian. And we compare them not only to Czech people, but also to permanent residents. In this way, we are able to contribute to the economic literature and discrimination that focuses on intersectional aspects. So to study how discrimination varies with additional demographic characteristics. For instance, I have another field experiment in which we study discrimination against transgender people, and we see whether discrimination varies not only based on your gender identity, but also based on your racial or ethnic group. Okay. So we contribute to the literature on intersectional economics and group misidentification. Group misidentification, maybe should wait one moment.
Yeah.
There is a question.
Yeah, I'll master the question.
Before we leave this part is what distinguishes Ukrainian refugees from other countries like Syria is that males, they were forbidden to exit the country because of military service.
Yes.
So it was only mothers with small children. How can you compare them with residents and local Czechs?
That's a perfect question. Thank you for asking. We embedded this issue in the experimental design. So our fictitious applicants, they are all female, and they disclose in a natural way in their message the fact that they don't have kids. Okay. So they can work during like shift hours during the weekend and so on. So there shouldn't be that problem that you mentioned. And it was one of our main concerns when we were preparing the experimental design. Did I answer your question? I will go more in detail later on. So, okay, as I was mentioning, one of the novel aspects of this experiment is that we study also group misidentification. Group misidentification, to my knowledge, is not studied in economics. And what is that? Imagine the case of American Japanese citizens who were interned in camps during the Second World War. They were treated as if they were Japanese, even if they were Americans. Or think also of the case of pretty much anybody who vaguely looked like he was Asian during COVID time in the US. A lot of these people were treated as if they were Chinese, and therefore as if they were, let's say, responsible for the pandemic. And this is one of the consequences of what was called the Kung flu, right? The rhetoric of the then administration of the US. So more concretely, in this experiment, we will test two hypotheses. First of all, whether there is a Ukrainian-Russian refugee penalty. So we will test whether employers are as likely to respond to refugees from the Russian linguistic group as from the Ukrainian linguistic group. And then we test also the possible presence of a Russian penalty. So we will test whether employers are as likely to respond to Ukrainian and Russian refugees as to Russian permanent residents. And what we expected, and it's also what we found, is that Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group are treated worse than Ukrainians from the Ukrainian linguistic group, and they are treated the same as Russian permanent residents. Then we will be able also to test whether the Lex-Ukraine effectiveness changes over time, because this first wave lasted a few months, about 6 months. So we can see whether the gap, if there is a gap, changes over time. And we thought about that because as it appeared from the media, all over Europe, at the very beginning of the war, there was a solid support to do the Ukrainian cause, but then as the time passed by, there were the first protests in EU countries of people that were concerned about political or economic repercussions of the war. So there is that possibly, if there was a gap between Czech people and Ukrainian refugees, this gap has increased over time. Finally, we test something also that is new in economics, that is the so-called collective cyclic numbing. What is that? The idea is came to me during COVID time as well, right? So during COVID time, there were articles on the New York Times discussing this theory and suggesting that the emotional response of people to tragedies is not linear. So imagine you see one people dying, you feel terrible. But if you see 2 people dying, you don't feel twice as terrible. Okay, so the idea is that there is a concave relationship between number of victims and the measure of empathy toward these victims. So in our particular study, what we do is that we interacted the dummies for refugee and the refugee group with the number of victims in the week before we contacted the employer, the number of victims in Ukraine. So it's not the cumulative amount of victims up until that point, but just the number of victims in the week before in Ukraine. We interacted with the dummies. And then to capture also the concave relationship, there is an additional interaction that is the dummy with the number of victims at the power of 2. So what we would expect is that the first interaction has a positive estimate. The coefficient is positive, and the second one is negative, right? It should be a concave relationship. Okay, so is there any question about this particular theory, collective cyclic numbing? No? All right. So I give you just a sneak peek into the results to make sure we will be on time and they will deliver all the findings. What we find is that the refugees are about 10 percentage points less likely than Czech applicants to receive a response. We find also that refugees from the Russian linguistic group are treated worse than compatriots from the Ukrainian linguistic group, and they are treated the same as Russian permanent residents. Then we find that when we look at the evolution of the gap over time, we see that at the beginning there is no gap between refugees and Czech applicants, but then as the time passes by, we observe a negative gap which increases over time. And finally, about the collective recycling numbing, we find evidence of this phenomenon for Ukrainian refugees from the Russian linguistic group. So we observed that their callback rate increases with the increase in the number of victims in the week before we contact the employer, but at a decreasing rate. We do the same study also for Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group. I just let you think about the possible result for a moment. If you look at the result that we found for Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group, maybe you can guess what we find. So what we find is that for refugees from the Russian linguistic group, there is no relationship at all between the number of victims in the week before and the callback rate. So not only there is no evidence of collective recycling dumping, but we see that there is no relationship between the victims and the callback rate. So it seems is an additional and different piece of evidence suggesting that there is a group misidentification. So they are not treated as if they were Ukrainian refugees. So now I will go into the details of the experiment. So the first wave of the experiment was conducted between March 24 and September 9, 2022. We contacted the 10,000 employers, which gives 20,000 observations. Each employer received 2 messages, as I mentioned earlier, one from the control group and one from a treatment group. And these messages were sent 7 days apart, and the order of the messages was randomized. So how did we signal all these characteristics of the fictitious applicants? And what are the characteristics of these applicants? So first of all, as I mentioned earlier on, they are all female. Female applicants. The gender, of course, is disclosed to the name of the applicants. In the message that I can show you if we have time, we also disclose the fact that this applicant doesn't have any kids. And why we chose female applicants? Exactly because of the reasons that I was discussing earlier with Almas. Because men between 18 and 60 years old were barred from leaving the country. And also at the beginning of the war, there was uncertainty as to whether Ukrainian embassies could summon Ukrainian men and deport them back to Ukraine. Okay. And also we wanted to focus on female applicants because there was a bit of concern that men refugees, like male refugees in Czech Republic could have been perceived as if they were from the left tail of the productivity distribution for some reason. For instance, if there is some undisclosed disability that allowed them not to take part to the war, or maybe someone who managed to escape the draft, and maybe they could have been perceived as if they were irresponsible because of some social norms and the recent history of Czech Republic and resistance against the Soviets and so on. So we wanted to avoid all these possible issues. So that's why we focused on female applicants. Then how did we signal the linguistic group and the immigration status? We use a few devices. So first of all, the group was disclosed through the name. So Czech applicants had a combination of name and surname that sounded Czech. The same for Ukrainian permanent residents and Ukrainians from the Ukrainian linguistic group, and the same for the Russian counterpart. Each employer received two messages, as I said earlier. One was always from the control group, that is the Czech people, and one instead with 25% probability from either of the treatment groups. So refugee from the Ukrainian linguistic group, from the Russian linguistic group, Ukrainian permanent resident, and Russian permanent resident. We additionally disclosed the linguistic group with an immigration status sentence that we'll mention in a minute. So for refugees, we use two signals. So when we contact the employer, we send just a short email, and we use some version of the following phrase that says, I just came from Ukraine. At that moment, in that period, it meant that that person is a refugee. And we added the sentence at the end of the email saying something like, apologies for possible grammar mistakes. I'm translating this message with Google Translate from Ukrainian or from Russian to Czech. So this is for only for refugees, okay? And we used these two signals for the group Ukrainian or Russian because we thought that it's more likely that only older generation of Czech employers could have told the difference between the Russian and the Ukrainians by the family name and the name. Okay, so we wanted to avoid that someone misunderstood the signal, so we added this additional sentence at the end of the message. So that is unmistakable. It's sure that that person is a refugee, so it's Ukrainian and is either from the Ukrainian linguistic group or the Russian linguistic group. For permanent residents, instead, there is no reference to Google Translate because they speak Czech, but they say something like, I'm Ukrainian or I'm Russian and I am a permanent resident. Also, this is a natural signal because if you are Ukrainian or Russian, you are a third country national, so you are not from the EU, and you would normally need a visa, someone who sponsors someone who sponsors you. Okay. Instead, if you are a permanent resident, you don't need any sponsor. Okay, then. If there is no question on this particular aspect, I can go on with the description of the experiment.
I just wanted kind of a slightly clarification. These jobs are kind of on like temporary basis in general, the type of jobs these are, or are these jobs that might be on, somebody machine operator or cleaner is permanently hired? I mean, the reason I'm asking is that it might just also give the sense that if you're a refugee, you might, I don't know how the situation was, that you might be traveling to, might travel to another country or whatever. Whereas if you're a permanent resident, then that shows a bit more kind of, stability.
Yes, that is a very good question, and we think that there could have been an issue of that type. There could have been such issue. We didn't know actually how to address it.
Okay.
There surely is something like that. The concern is that they could have gone back soon, and that was a concern in particular at the beginning of the war because there was uncertainty as to how long the war would have lasted. So it could have been strange maybe for employers to think, okay, I hired this person and then maybe in 3 weeks or something, this person will go back. But we also checked with the employment officers in the unemployment office, and it seems that it's pretty normal. This kind of jobs, they don't like this sort of concerns don't pertain too much to this kind of jobs.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Maybe sometimes because these kind of jobs are kind of advertised on, short-term basis, so it might alleviate. So it might be useful to kind of have a bit more information exactly what, like examples of what kind of contract.
All right. Okay, I've taken a note. Thank you. All right. So, what kind of jobs we apply to in particular? They are ISCO jobs, in category 8 and 9. Not only that, we selected a subset of these jobs that, according to the Ministry of Labor statistics, are jobs that are typically taken up by female third country nationals. So female workers who are neither Czech nor EU citizens. So these are jobs that one would expect that are taken up by female refugees. Okay. I've already mentioned what kind of jobs they are. So jobs in which education experience, skills, language skills, they don't have much of a relevance. There is no contact with customers, no management of co-workers, so you don't need to send a CV or a cover letter, and it's pretty standard to seek for a job in this way. Just send a message and inquire for the job. How we selected instead employers? We selected the employers randomly from two databases. One is from the National Statistical Office registry, and one it's a very popular private registry that it's called Orbis. Why we did that? The reason is that any company could be in Orbis, while in order to be in the National Statistical Office registry and therefore also benefits from, for instance, collaborations with the Unemployment Office, you need to respect certain guidelines. For instance, you cannot discriminate. So the idea is that this database from the National Statistical Office registry, employers that are in this database should discriminate less. So we contacted people from two different registries, thinking about possible heterogeneity analysis in later stages. Also, the employers were drawn in such a way that we contacted people from all over Czech Republic, so from all of the regions, and also with higher probability from the regions that have a larger population with respect to the national population, okay? So here there are some ethical aspects. I don't know if maybe I could just quickly summarize that we wanted to be super sure that we were respecting all the guidelines and even going beyond that, because this experiment started only a few weeks after the beginning of the war. So we wanted to avoid any possible problem, also repercussions on people who are actually looking for a job. So we used a lot of, we followed a lot of different steps. So first of all, we sought approval from the ethics committee. In this case, we asked to Cardiff University. We also promptly and politely declined any possible response that we received from employers. Also, we expected that a relatively large amount of emails would have received automatic responses from employers, and that happens because I don't know, employers might have a full inbox, might be on vacation, and so on. Despite that, we did not adjust our target sample. Also, the fact that we contacted the employers from different databases and from all over Czech Republic also reduced the probability that there could be negative externalities on people who are actually looking for a job. Because if you think of the first correspondence tests that were conducted and published in economic journals, you would see that maybe they were conducted into cities like Boston and Chicago, or in Sweden it was Göteborg and Stockholm. But when you focus too much on one particular geographic area, you increase the probability that, first of all, there could be detection because employers might talk with each other. And also there might be some effect on actual job seekers, okay? Because if employees talk with each other and suspect there is an experiment, that might decrease also the callback rate of people who are actually looking for a job. So by expanding the target geographic area, we reduce this probability. Also, it might look like we contacted a lot of employers, 10,000, but actually Czech Republic is the country in Europe with the largest amount of employers per capita. So the percentage of employers we contacted is actually in the centesimal percentage point. I don't remember the exact value. Now, let's go to the raw results. When we look at macro groups, so only Czech people, refugees, and permanent residents, we see that Czech people's response rate is about 16%, refugees is about 6%, and permanent resident is about 9%. When we take the difference between this callback, they are all statistically significant different. Then when we look at differences between microgroups, so Czech people, refugees from the Ukrainian and Russian linguistic group, and Ukrainian and Russian permanent residents, we see that Ukrainians from the Ukrainian linguistic group have a callback rate of about 7 percentage points. Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group is 4.5. Ukrainian permanent residence is 13, and Ukrainian permanent and the Russian permanent resident is 5.7. When we take a difference between all these callback rates, we see that they are all statistically significantly different. But what's interesting is that if you look at the very bottom here, the difference between Russian permanent residents and Ukrainian from the Russian linguistic group is just barely statistically significant. And then in the regression analysis, when we control for the usual fixed effects, this is no longer statistically significant. Here is just the main results. So we use a linear probability model. We regress. Our outcome is a dummy, which equals 1 if the candidate received a response. And it's regressed on a dummy for being a refugee, a dummy for being a permanent resident, and then a zero fixed effects, just the firm sample, Orbis or national registry, a vector for a region in Czech Republic, a vector for a week of the experiment, a vector of dummies for a day of the week, and a vector of dummies for the names of the company that we conduct. So here, if we look at the estimates, we see that the coefficients don't change as we add control variables. So that suggests that the randomization worked as intended. And we see that refugees suffer a gap that is about 9.6 percentage point, as I mentioned earlier. And permanent residence gap is lower to 6.6. Also, if you look at the sample size, you see that is 18,500, and that is because we eliminated all the pair of messages. So we eliminated the combination of check, of control and treatment group whenever at least one of the two fictitious applicants received an automatic message, okay? Because otherwise there could be some influence from this random event, which could be like the fact that an employer is on vacation, full inbox, and so on. So we eliminated both messages, both observations. Then we conduct the same analysis, but here we differentiate based on the refugees based on their linguistic group, and also we differentiate between permanent residents. And what we observe is that Ukrainians from the Ukrainian linguistic group face a gap that is 8.2 percentage points, Ukrainian permanent residents 3 percentage points, and Ukrainian from the Russian linguistic group and Russian permanent residents face a gap that is about 11 or 10 percentage points. And when you take a difference, the difference between these two coefficients, it's not statistically significant. Here is our study on the variation over time. So what we did is that we used the same model specification and interacted the dummies these dummies here, with month. Okay, so basically to summarize, what we observe is that the callback rate decreased over time for all of the groups, and it seems that the decrease is slightly larger for Russian permanent residents and for Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group. Then, how did we study collective cycling numbing? Again, we take the main model specification. We add a control for the number of victims divided by 1,000. And these victims are the victims in Ukraine in the week before we contact the employer, right? So we insert this variable. We interacted with the dummies, the two dummies for refugees. And then we add a second interaction between victims divided by 1,000 at the power of 2 and these two dummies, okay? So what we expect, as I mentioned earlier, is that the first type of interaction with victims divided by 1,000 will have a positive coefficient, while the second interaction with victims divided by 1,000 at the power of 2 will have a negative coefficient. And this is exactly what we find. Here we see that the first interaction is positive and the second is negative for Ukrainian refugees from the Ukrainian linguistic group. While for Ukrainian refugees from the Russian linguistic group, there is no evidence of a relationship between these interactions and the callback rate. So not only we don't find evidence of collective cycling numbing, but it looks like this is further evidence, further indirect evidence that there is group misidentification, because the callback rate of Ukrainians from the Russian linguistic group doesn't depend at all on the number of victims in Ukraine, differently from the case of Ukrainians from the Ukrainian linguistic group. Is there any question? Okay, if there is no question, I wrap up. So I will briefly mention the next steps of the experiment. We will study not only the callback rate, but also the positive responses. So we have arrays categorizing the responses and see the different type of responses that we receive, so that the outcome we will study is the positive response rate instead of just the callback rate. We will also study the role of language proficiency with an additional wave, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, to understand whether there might actually be a possible role of language skills. Because as I mentioned now, after a couple of years into this war, there are a lot of courses for refugees who speak either Ukrainian or Russian, who want to learn Czech. Okay. So basically we can take the message that I mentioned earlier that is sent by refugees, and instead of adding the sentence at the end saying, I'm translating with Google Translate from Ukrainian or Russian to Czech, we can add a mention about the fact that this applicant took an intensive course of Russian or Ukrainian to Czech. We will conduct also a series of heterogeneity analysis to dig more into mechanisms. So we can study, for instance, the effect of competition between firms on discrimination. We can also look at the firm size and whether that plays a role on discrimination, because the idea is that the larger the firm, the more standardized is the hiring process. While competition between firms would serve a study to investigate whether there is a taste-based discrimination, right? Because with increasing competition, there should be a decrease in discrimination. We can also look at how discrimination varies with the local economic performances, although we are not really sure that this study would give interesting results, because Czech Republic in general is very performing with very low unemployment rate, and also the inflation rate doesn't really change that much across Czech Republic. Okay. We will also try to understand whether local preferences with respect to topics that are related to our studies, such as immigration or relationship with Russia in general, might play a role. And how do we do that? We would look at what is the agenda, the political agenda of the party that won in the latest local elections in Czech Republic before the beginning of the war, right? And finally, we will of course look at whether discrimination is affected by the geographic distribution of refugees. And I think that's it. I've mentioned everything. So thank you for your attention. If you have any question, any suggestion, please don't hesitate to speak up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Luca. Almas?
Thank you for your presentation, Luca. Two things that I thought it was important, your last slide is, one is ownership of the firms, whether they are owned by like permanent resident Ukrainian in Czech Republic. Another one is whether these firms are producing to export to Ukraine, then probably this discrimination will vanish.
Great. Yeah, this is very, very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that we should be able to do. And the first part of your suggestion is actually something that we thought also, because in both database that we're using, we should be able to observe the name of the owner of the firm. Yeah. I will check also whether we can somehow measure or somehow detect whether this firm might export to Ukraine. Yeah. Thank you.
Could I just add to that, if it is possible to find if the firm is female owned or the manager is female versus male?
Yeah.
Because females are the people applying are all females, so it might change.
Yeah, sure. This is something that we should be able to do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we should be able to look at it. We also wanted to do something else, like a sentiment analysis, analyze the test and see more or less what would be the response and whether the response or the way it was written varied with the gender of the person that wrote the response, which might not necessarily be the owner of the firm, but could be the secretary or something. But for this particular study would be problematic because like we don't have so many data to use for the text analysis as if it was English, because with English you have an enormous database that you use to train and to understand how to measure the sentiment in the message. Yeah, so unfortunately, but yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Madeline?
This was very interesting.
Thank you.
So can you look at news coverage? So you have it like, I guess, an official death count that you're looking at, but it might be interesting to know how much people either nationally within Czechia or locally are aware of it in some way, and news coverage is sort of the best proxy I can think of.
Yeah, sure. We could do that. We were wondering about doing that. For now, what we use is a database from I think the UN, from an office of the UN that collects information from Ukrainian local news, and it's possible to estimate the number of victims, but of course that doesn't reflect necessarily the news coverage in Czech Republic, So for now, we're using this imperfect proxy of, let's say, war intensity. But we could look definitely at the local news coverage.
Could you remind me what the result was, that if there is a big event, then the response rate went down? Is that?
So for now, we didn't look at specific events because
Okay.
that could have been somehow arbitrary. I remember when there was Bucha or something. Like after a few months after the beginning of the war, that was definitely a big event with a big coverage, but we were a bit worried that the selection of the event in this particular case might have been more or less arbitrary.
Yeah.
So we relied more on just the number of victims, but it's definitely something, a suggestion or a comment that we have already heard a few times.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, going once, going twice. No. Great. Thanks very much, Luca. And I think, the extra things that you mentioned in the next wave is really quite interesting, because by region, I was thinking already when you were presenting and stuff like that. So that's great. Okay.
Yeah, we have official statistics about the distribution, which is centralized and managed by the state. So we can definitely do that and study whether there is a contact theory and how it proceeds.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you all for having me.
Very good presentation, very interesting paper. And see you all next month. Bye.
Bye-bye.